We prefer to think that we're these extremely rational creatures that only care about truth, but I just think that's not what the world looks like at all. This is why so many people have so many conflicting beliefs. Oh, we're all purely irrational, and yet we have polar opposite and really entrenched beliefs from one another.
The human brain, and therefore the human mind, has evolved over millions of years. What exactly are our brains and minds adapted for, and how do these adaptations affect the way we think? Look, these are immeasurably large questions, but because they're so deeply interesting, they're worth having a shot at. With me to do this is an expert behavioural scientist, Dr. Cory Clark, who's primarily interested in how social motivations influence human judgment and empirical beliefs. But also, Cory has an interest in lots of other things, including photography, and I'm particularly interested in planning a possible future goat sanctuary. So just briefly, perhaps you could explain to people what, have I said that right? Photography, what they are.
Photography is taking pictures while you're jogging on your iPhone. And photography is taking pictures of your dog. So it's pretty straightforward. Probably habits that almost everyone has, but I may or may not have coined the terms for the hobbies.
They're excellent portmanteaus. The photography one sounds extra tricky, right? Because you're taking pictures. I mean, does the modern iPhone help you to do that without blur, or is there still a kind of skill level involved?
I allow people to pause to take their pictures if necessary, but you also can take them while running. I've done both, and sometimes, the blur adds some dimension.
Yeah. And you do get blur. You do get blur if you do it. Okay.
Sometimes, yeah.
Sometimes,
yeah.
okay.
iPhones have gotten better and better, so my more recent pictures are much better than the ones I was doing, 10 years ago.
And the goats, why goats? Why not donkeys?
Well, I would get donkeys too. That's a good question. Goats are really friendly and they'll like approach humans, which is cute. And they, how they hop and their little butts swing to the side. So that's the motivation for the goats. And also, I think goats are relatively low maintenance when it comes to farm animals, like just give them their space. I mean, they will eat and destroy everything, so you got to worry about that. But it's mostly cuteness, but donkeys are pretty cute too.
Goats need something to climb on, don't they? Goats need something to climb on. You need to make sure that's in the field.
I mean, I've got a shed that I don't use. They could climb on the shed, maybe.
Okay. And they're friendly, don't they butt you if you turn your back to them?
I've never had a goat butt me, but I imagine a grumpy goat could. But my goats would love me, so they probably wouldn't.
I mean, I do like goats as well, which is why I noticed it. I do like goats, and I do have an interest in the future in having goats. I don't have a shed that they can already hop on, but maybe in the future.
Get one of those children's playgrounds, Those would work for a goat.
Yeah. There are lots of options. I think they're pretty flexible.
I don't think they care about what they're climbing. It could just be like a picnic table.
No, I think that's right. Okay, well, I shall bear that in mind. Thank you. Okay, so on to an even more complex issue, the human mind. Perhaps we could start off, Cory, with, I mean, some people will have thought about this and some people won't have done, understandably. I think a lot of people might presume that we're naturally rational thinkers and that they themselves are rational thinkers. Are they right about that?
Yes and no. I would say humans are pretty good at reasoning and being rational, especially when someone forces them to by calling them out on their hypocrisy and double standards and things like that. But not purely rational. And it doesn't even, I mean, I should say different scholars disagree about the extent to which people are more or less rational and more or less biased by different environmental conditions or social forces. But I think from an evolutionary perspective, it doesn't even really make sense to expect humans to be rational all the time, because we should have evolved to think in ways that promote fitness and so survival, and also because humans are social creatures, um, trying to gain status in the social group, and especially to avoid being ostracized. These are really, really important things. So we should form beliefs that help us avoid being ostracized by the social group. So we have some kind of like psychological conformity to group beliefs. I think one of the easiest ways to see this, or the best examples, is just to look at how many religions there have been and how many gods there have been over the years, where the people within a particular social group were very confident that their god was the right one or their religion was the right one, but they're all different everywhere. So it can't be true that all of these groups are thinking purely rationally and stumbling upon the correct answer when it comes to those beliefs. But what would be true is that whatever your local group came to believe in, if that became an important local belief, or, in whatever community you were living in, there would be really strong pressures to accept that as the true one, the true God, and the true religion. And we know throughout history people have been killed for not accepting the proper, whatever the most important beliefs were to the local group. If you get booted from the group, you get killed. Well, there goes that your genes are over. So humans should have evolved to reason in ways that help them get acceptance in the group, avoid being kicked out of the group, especially, or being killed by the group, especially, and then also to gain status within the group. So people have to think in ways that help them persuade their fellow group members that they're valuable and that they should get to stick around, and then they also should get status and resources and access to the best resources, the best mates, etc.
Okay, so
Did I answer your question?
excellently. But
Okay.
just to break that down a little bit for people that may not have thought about all these issues such as ostracization. So particularly in the past, still in the present to some degree, but particularly in the past, if a member of a group is, as you say, kicked out, ostracized from that group, even if they're not beaten up, if they're removed from the group and no longer allowed to fully interact with that group, they're in a lot of trouble, right?
Yeah. So even today, when we have all of these amenities that help us survive very easily, it would be hard to be a complete loner that didn't depend on other people's resources, to do everything yourself, provide yourself shelter, heat, food. To do that on your own would be really, really, really hard. Now go back thousands of years when we didn't have all these amenities, it would be near impossible. So I'll invest in this thing, you invest in that thing, then we'll exchange resources and it helps everyone. Um, Being ostracized now is terrible. Being ostracized then would be basically a death sentence. So this should be something our human psychology should work really hard to avoid, to make sure that we're in good favor with whatever our social group, whoever that group is, that we're in good favor with them, and we are not at risk of being kicked out, essentially, because then yeah, you might die.
Right, which is a big deal. And as you say, game over for passing on genes or any
Mm.
more genes anyway. And so that would explain why often people feel really bad about losing group membership and work very hard not to lose that group membership. And so potentially, whether it's now, is it subconscious or conscious, Cory, or a bit of both, that people will accept a premise of the group, for example, a certain God or a certain way of viewing the world, or they'll accept that in order to stay within the group, even if they're not clear that it's really true?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say it's probably a little bit of both. A lot of it would be unconscious, because if your belief is insincere, you're more likely to get caught. So it's helpful to have really sincere beliefs that conform to the group. If people in the group find out that you're a phony and you're just saying that and you're not really committed to whatever the group belief is, you might still get ostracized. So having sincere beliefs would be more helpful than having inauthentic beliefs. Also, having sincere beliefs would help you persuade others that you're committed and then gain status in your group for supporting whatever that group belief is. So I think often people are unconscious of these things. Now, you can potentially become conscious of them, and maybe some of the time people are. But that would not be as effective as holding these beliefs sincerely. And then in that case, people would not be aware. They're not aware that the reason they hold certain beliefs is because, they're afraid of getting booted from the group. That's really just like an emotion that people experience when they're at risk of being ostracized.
There's a film I rewatched the other day called the Strange Death of Stalin.
Hmm.
And or it may have even just been called The Death of Stalin, to be honest with you. Anyway, it's a dark comedy. It's really, really good. It's maybe 5 years old. It's well worth watching. It's a comedy, but it documents that period of time just before and then directly after Stalin in Soviet Union running the Soviet Union died, and then what happens after that. And it was mostly around the rest of the Politburo, so the other men who were high up in the system. And it also touched on the masses and how horrendous it was for people in Russia at that time. But even those guys that were nearly at the top, but not quite because they weren't quite Stalin, were incredibly fearful. And no one trusted each other.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, Stalin, I think, was very fearful as well. And quite a lot is made of, I mean, again, it's a story based on reality, but nonetheless, it's fairly, I think it's very enlightening. It made quite a big play of how some of these members of the Politburo would work very, very hard to convince Stalin that they were total believers in everything that he was doing, including writing lists pretty much of random people that had to be shot. Staying up all night. He was very interested in cowboy films. So he'd encourage everyone, he'd force them effectively to stay up all night and watch these cowboy films with them, even though, which is far less than it. Anyway, and some of them, one of the characters, I don't know if this was true or not, but he'd go home in the evening, having spent time with Stalin, and go through, and his wife would help him go through all the things that he had said to Stalin, how Stalin had reacted. Did he laugh at that? Did he not laugh at that? What did he seem to find fun? Now, and making the point that I guess in extremis, he was a group and they were super desperate to stay in this group, because if they were ostracized by Stalin, they were dead.
It's
I mean,
over.
really, they would be murdered. It was over. And would have been to some fair degree very consciously aware that they were faking it. But also on some, can I just say one more thing on this? Actually, thinking about it, Michael Palin played a character, was it Molotov, I think, who was also quite befuddled by the whole thing, and in one level really did believe in this extreme socialism, this communism, and that Stalin was right, whilst also being phenomenally fearful of his life, but so devoted to Stalin that he actually accepted Stalin taking his own wife off to the gulags. And anyway, so I won't go on any further, but yes, those would be some examples of, in extremis, the blending of subconscious and conscious going along with the group ideas because of absolute need to survive.
Yeah, I think in very extreme and obvious cases like that, it can become more conscious, and especially if you're being asked to go along with something really big or absurd, you might end up becoming more aware. But I think a lot of the time, in more everyday kinds of circumstances, people aren't really aware and they don't think about it. But yeah, it can become a conscious thing. I see this with a lot of in fact, I've interviewed academic psychology professors, and they report pretty high levels of self-censorship, things that they won't say that they think are empirically true about human psychology. And they're very aware that they're not saying certain things that they believe are true because they don't want to be ostracized. They don't want to lose status among the academic community. They don't want to risk being called names on Twitter and losing, whatever professional status they have. So even though I'm sure a lot of them also hold beliefs sincerely that they hold for reasons of like social pressure, they are also aware of beliefs they hold that they view as socially costly, and so they keep them to themselves and don't speak out. So yeah, it's actually a good question. Like, could I put a percentage on, how much is conscious for? I guess I probably couldn't. That would be really difficult. But yeah,
Yeah,
both things are happening. Yeah.
it would depend on the individual, the context, the circumstances, and so forth. Now, those, for example, psychology professors, is it that there's perhaps two levels here. They could be simply not engaging in those conversations, or they could be taking it arguably further, and actually agreeing or claiming that they agree with something that they don't. Do you know which level they're going to? Just, I'm not going to talk about it so I don't reveal my true beliefs, or will they actually lie effectively to keep themselves in with the crowd?
I didn't ask that specific question, but I think both things are happening. But the former, or the withholding of the beliefs is maybe a sort of like lower bar, right? Like almost everyone's doing that. Almost everyone withholds their beliefs sometimes
Mm.
because they're afraid of social costs. Fully asserting the opposite of what you believe seems a step further, but I have no doubts that people do that too, especially in certain company. And if the pressure's being put on you and someone says like, do you believe X? You might say, no, 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 I don't believe that.
Okay, yes, that's of course true. Sorry, but do you think that's happening sometimes in academia? I mean, that's a big deal, isn't it, for an academic, for a university lecturer or professor to state something that they believe to be untrue. It's one thing to kind of steer away from certain areas, but to say something they believe is untrue, that's a big deal. Do you feel that might be happening at anything above kind of a negligible level?
You mean like in terms of the percentage of people asserting empirical claims that they don't believe are true?
Go on then, yes, that one.
I think, yeah, it probably is happening above a negligible level. There psychology professors, and I think probably professors more broadly, are pretty afraid these days. And it's really interesting because they're afraid of the same things as everyone else. For the most part, they're not all that afraid of getting fired. They're really just afraid of people not liking them. They're afraid of, getting called mean names. They're essentially afraid of getting ostracized among their peer group, which is other professors, but also, being ostracized more generally. And, you know, random people on Twitter calling them mean names. Like
See,
these
that's
are
interesting.
these are
That
powerful.
they are. Now that's interesting because gosh, maybe I'm revealing a lack of understanding of myself, of which there's no doubt a plenty. But I would honestly say I'd be far more concerned about losing my job than being called names or considered a pariah, up to a point, depending on the matter, a level of degree.
I think
I
it's
really
because
think,
losing the job is less likely. So
right,
being
right, okay.
ostracized by peers, that can happen pretty quickly, and people see it happen all the time. Someone says the wrong thing, they say something in the wrong context, they publish a paper people don't like. Um, those things can happen, and they're very unpredictable. Whereas typically with your job, your employer has some level of accountability. They're paying a cost to, like, firing someone for a seemingly illegitimate reason. It can become expensive legal issue. And so I think the reason people are less afraid of that is because it feels much less likely. Whereas, you know, irritating some of your peers, that's very likely. It could happen given how many contentious issues there are in academia. Um, taking a side, any side, is going to irritate some people, and people want to avoid that.
Yes, even though in a sense they might not seek to irritate per se, but seek to exercise other people to generate those. But we'd all like to think, or a lot of us would like to think, that we can separate the emotion from our opinion so that we can go and have a chat with someone who has a different view to us and walk away totally as friendly with them as we were before, whatever level that was. But we can't, can we? Or we find it very hard. If we have a disagreement with someone, like a clash, we're very good at remembering that, and that colors how we think about them, at least for an extensive period of time into the future. Maybe not forever. I mean, people can make comebacks, friendships can make comebacks, but it's a big deal to people, isn't it, when they discover that they believe something in a fundamentally a fundamental belief they have is not supported by someone who they thought was a friend or a good acquaintance. That's a big deal for people.
Yeah, I think the extent to which people are capable of having conversations about, contentious issues, that's going to differ from person to person, but it's also going to differ from context to context. So some people are going to be more capable of that than others. A lot of people aren't. And at least for me, it's really easy to see this. Like when you're having a disagreement with someone about something you don't care about, you're like, oh, you believe that and I believe this, whatever, move on. When it's something you care about, like you start getting a little warm and your heart starts beating a little faster and, you start to get really uncomfortable and, sometimes you lose your temper. That shows you that there's something else going on, that it's not just you're thinking about this issue in a cool, calm way and you're like, well, whatever, agree to disagree. It shows you that there's something that's important to you for some reason that's preventing you from being able to either think about it rationally and figure out what's going on, or to just say, oh, whatever, like you believe that, I believe this, no big deal. And I think one way we can see this with academics is when they have sort of disagreements about their competing theories, say, they don't find their adversaries sort of like interesting and intriguing. Like they want to approach that person and be like, wow, like you think this thing and I think this thing. That's crazy. Like, let's figure out what's going on. Like, what an interesting mystery. This will be so fun to solve. It's you're defending that perspective. I'm defending this one. And it is a battle to the end. And I don't care what you have to say. I'm going to prove myself right. So again, like it's going to vary from situation to situation and from person to person, but we know people often are more interested in defending whatever their beliefs are for whatever reason. Often social reasons, like whatever the belief is really important to their social status. That matters more than the truth. And so, yeah, we prefer to think that we're these extremely rational creatures that only care about truth, but I just think that's not what the world looks like at all. This is why
No.
so many people have so many conflicting beliefs. Oh, we're all purely irrational, and yet we have polar opposite and really entrenched beliefs from one another.
Yes. And the way you describe that feeling a bit hotter and the heart rate, that's spot on. Yes. And it happens like that, and I've experienced it myself, I'm sure many more times than I can remember. Um, it might be in a situation where somebody said something, and yes, that goes quite counter to something that I feel is quite important to me. And straight away it's, oh no, you're one of them. If I could be brutally honest, and then I
Yeah.
do try and counter that, but I struggle. And so yes, there's something deeper going on. It's or at least additional to rational thinking. On the other hand, my experience also tells me that sometimes it's possible to diffuse these things, or at least not allow the fuse to be lit, if one goes in and tapers. If you can see the conflict coming, which you can't always, but if you can and build up from the back slowly, you can almost warm people up to it, so they kind of don't pull a muscle when you start working hard on the argument. I think that can help. I also think the other thing that can help, and maybe this is obvious, but is to sort of lay the groundwork and say, even if we disagree, neither of us are bad people. We're both at least thinking that we're good people, and that we've got a moral basis for our reasons, even if we're mistaken. We're not trying to be horrible. And I think sometimes people label other people with different opinions as being not nice people, and that, of course, is always going to make it very difficult.
Yeah, the question is, are both people willing to do that? Because if we come into a disagreement and I'm willing to be like, look, I know you're a good person. I know like this is you're not thinking that way because you have bad motives. But if you're coming at me and being like, well, you are terrible, like there's not going to be much hope for that, because now you're demonizing me. It's going to make me not like you. Um, and and so the odds that you're going to get two people who are going to come into a conversation where they have like conflicting beliefs that are really important to them, that both people are going to be willing to do that, they're not. I don't know how high those odds are, but it's often not going to be the case. And you can't necessarily trust the other person to like do that favor for you. Um, which I think is what makes it really hard. One thing people seem to do is sort of try to feel the other person out. Okay, I know you disagree with me on this really important thing. And then I might say something, well, okay, but you would agree with X, right? And I'm trying to be like, okay, do we have any basis for agreement? Like, is there any way we're going to be able to have a productive conversation? And if you're like, no, blah, 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 I'm like, okay, not worth my time. And either I'll try to get out of the conversation, or maybe I'll call you an asshole, and hate you for the rest of my life. Um, so there are ways people can try to diffuse these situations, but they're not always going to work. And a lot of people are working on that problem right now. Like, how can we get people who disagree to have more productive conversations? And I think a big part of it is just some people are pretty capable of doing it. Other people are not that capable of doing it. And some topics are just way more inflammatory than other topics.
Yes, indeed. Now, that's been a super interesting discussion about how people are defending their positions, perhaps with an eye on the group, and perhaps with an eye on with an eye on the group. But they might also be irrational in an argument when there isn't a sort of risk of ostracization or a risk of looking foolish or unpleasant in front of a group. And I suspect you know more about this than I do. So the idea of certain triggers such as disgust. So if something triggers someone's disgust, someone feels disgusted by something, I get the impression that it is very hard, at least in that moment, very hard to make that disgusted person feel that maybe their opinion is not entirely sacrosanct, it's highly 100%. Let me give you an example. So this is an example given by Jonathan Haidt. I suspect, with respect to him, maybe some other people have too. And actually, I'm not going to recapitulate it very well, but off the cuff. But two people, let's say they're male and female, it doesn't matter, but two people want to have sex with each other. They're adults. They're not married. They don't have partners. They don't have venereal diseases. Okay. And they're both willing to do it, and they're going to use contraception. And most people would say, well, that's fine. But then if they're told that these two people are brother and sister, for a lot of people, maybe almost literally everyone, mostly whatever, will say, well, no, that's not right. No, they can't. Well, actually, in a lot of countries, I guess it's illegal. But let's put that aside. So then we'll strip that away. It's not illegal where they are. It's not illegal where they are. But Jonathan Haidt describes how people work very, very hard, even when they're drip fed this additional information. Look, they're consenting, they're adults, they're using contraception. It's not illegal wherever they're living. People work very, very hard to remain of the opinion that it shouldn't happen, that it's wrong, that they shouldn't have sex. And I think, and I don't think in that point there's any risk of ostracization. That there isn't a recording that's then going to be sent to their friends. But I think they're a disgust response, which is a very important response. Obviously, lots of things are disgusting for good reason, but that disgust response is a block to them thinking differently about the question. Is there something in that?
Yeah, so that is called moral dumbfounding. I used to do that scenario with my students all the time. Yeah, so essentially what you can do is chip away at all of their reasons that they think are rational reasons. So for example, they might say, well, even if they use two forms of birth control, they still could get pregnant. So it's still wrong. And then I'd be like, okay, well, let's say they're two brothers instead. Now they can't get pregnant. Is it okay for two brothers to have sex with each other? No. Okay, well, why not? And then they come up with other reasons, Well, it's against my religion. Well, do you support everything your religion says? No. Okay, well, then that's obviously not your one reason. Why this one? So you can kind of chip away at people's moral or people's like seemingly rational reasons and get them sort of back them in a corner so that they'll at least feel or experience or potentially admit, well, I just don't like it. It's just gross. It's icky. And that demonstration is supposed to show that a lot of our moral judgments are based on these sort of intuitive gut feelings, which also we would have evolved to have certain aversions to different kinds of behaviors because they protected us and they protected other people. It turns out incest, generally, at least when it's direct siblings, and maybe even first cousins, it can be pretty bad for the social group. And I think sex probably in general is really easy to moralize because it can cause so many problems. You know, as you see, people get diseases, people have unwanted pregnancies, and then you've got a child who doesn't have parents that can care for it. So I think that's really easy to moralize. And I think I would agree with you to an extent that that's not directly social, but things don't necessarily have to be directly social if like the context in which those reactions would have evolved are social. And morality is kind of inherently social. The whole purpose of morality is we're part of a group and we agree to adhere to a set of rules. You know, you're not going to do that and I'm not going to do that and it'll be better for everyone. And so I think you're particularly likely to get motivated reasoning in the context of morality because if I violate a norm, I say it's fine to have sex with your siblings. I'm kind of signaling to the group that I'm not going to go along with all the rules that we agreed to, and now I'm a bad interaction partner because we know what's right and wrong, and I'm saying no, that's not wrong. Maybe I'll break that rule one day. So I do think, you know, our psychology didn't evolve to deal with like particular novel abnormal cases that aren't the kinds of things we would interact with in our regular lives. It evolved to deal with like the types of things that would be helpful for an average person in a particular group. So I mean, I agree with you that disgust is a kind of emotional response that will affect all kinds of judgments that people make. But I think when it comes to morality, you kind of cannot escape the social element. I actually just ran a study just like 2 days ago where I was looking at like what are the criteria for someone to be a moral agent, like in order to be someone who deserves blame and judgment when they do something bad. And we actually saw diminished moral agency for a person who's stranded alone on an island their whole entire life. So perfectly cognitively capable, all the normal emotions of a regular human, just a regular human, but they're alone on an island. And that person is less of a moral agent. Why? Well, it doesn't matter. They can't harm anyone. They can't affect anyone, whether they're good or bad. It's kind of irrelevant. So blaming them is going to do no good. It's not going to deter. It's not going to help anyone to blame that person. So I think to try to pull morality away from the social. I should also say with the dumbfounding one, some people do come around. So there's your argument for the rationality. Like some people are like, you're right. I guess it is fine that those two people have sex.
Right. I wonder if that associates with personality type. I don't know.
Chillness.
Chillness. Is that measurable? I suppose it probably is actually in some respect. And I wonder, it would be great to have people under an MRI scanner, right, at these moments. So these moments when, and this is a bit crude, almost a bit rude of me, but when it seems like, and it happens to me, of course, as well, when it seems like the brain suddenly shuts down, you know, when the tripwire is tripped, and people say, no, I just, it'd be interesting to know if the bits of the brain lighting up are different or less, or something like that at these moments, and also in the moments where people say, yeah, actually, you know what, yeah, you've got me there. Yes, there's no escape. Yes, I suppose you're right. You would allow that. That's really interesting. Yeah, that's really interesting. Know what bits of the brain are really allowing that epiphany almost in the moment. I think that's very
Someone's
interesting.
probably done that study, but I'm not familiar. But
Really,
surely someone must have, right?
in an MRI scanner, got
I would think. I would think. But yeah, there would be individual differences too. Some people are they get more worked up about disagreement than other people.
and I suspect it's something people could be trained to be better at to some degree. I mean, I guess in the moment it might kind of fall apart, but at least in principle, people could be trained to accept elevating rationality over the gut reactions. I think that's probably true.
That might be true. A lot of people have tried.
Okay.
um, but what I would say is I think there might be something to making the social costs of violating rationality higher than the social costs um, of giving into the social group. So getting people to commit, like, I am a rational person, I don't care about whether this works for my politics or not. I just care about truth. If you really commit yourself to that and then you violate it, people will call you out. And so you're kind of creating a social cost for yourself for not being rational. And so I think that that potentially can help people, even when they might not want to believe something, admit, okay, well, I was wrong that time.
Yeah, yeah. There's another issue perhaps of whether people are saying it just to say you as the experimenter versus in a group. It's one
Mhm.
thing to have you and them, perhaps I'm just imagining, sitting in a room and you talk them through and maybe convince them of something they initially thought, no, no, that definitely can't be right. You convince them that in principle it could be.
Mhm.
People might be more willing to do that quietly between two people than in front of 10 of their peers.
Yeah, that's probably true as well. And then also just how important of an issue is it to that person? Some people might not have really strong emotional reaction to something like incest, but um, yeah, to the extent that people don't care about something, they'll be more likely to change their mind if it's not central to their identity, and again, not central to their status in a social group, or if they can do it completely privately. No one ever has to know what you said.
And it also depends whether they work out that whether it affects their other beliefs. Like it may or may
Mm,
not be too obvious how it links into other beliefs. And actually, one might convince someone of that in principle they could think about things differently, and then highlight how that clashes with their belief system, and then they might want to row back from that. I suspect one you could see that happen quite a lot if it, and that leads me on to a connected issue of cognitive dissonance. So something that again I've noticed um, and is interesting, and I think highlights this issue is uh, people, if they have young children, will often read books to them at night at bedtime or something, and often those books involve farm animals, maybe even goats,
mm,
and but as often sort of animals that are more often eaten, such as pigs or cows, and so they might be reading this farmyard story where the animals are anthropomorphized, and they're living their lives and they all go to sleep and then your child goes to sleep. Turn the clock back 1 or 2 hours earlier into the evening and that child sat at the dinner table eating sausages. Um, and so there seems to be issues such as that, which I think can be, but maybe you can tell me I'm wrong here. I think would be argued as being cognitive dissonance in the sense that at one moment people are using those people that eat sausages, not everyone does, but are using animals as just a way to get protein and energy, knowing that the majority of those animals aren't particularly well looked after. I mean, it varies a bit, but broadly speaking, they're not that well looked after, if at all. And then a short while later, they're then again employing those animals or using those concepts of those animals, this time in a very different way and treating them almost as human beings with emotions and feelings at the same level, which they may or may not have, but that's not a matter, and using that to give bedtime stories to their child. There seems to be quite a strong contradiction in that example, and yet it's very commonplace. And therefore, I would argue that could be put into the basket of irrational thinking. But I guess I'm stretching that slightly.
yeah, so there are going to be many situations where humans have sort of conflicting goals or intuitions, or and it doesn't mean one is more valid than the other necessarily. So people like delicious food. Pigs have a lot of fat, so they're pretty good. They're a pretty good source of calories, and humans really like things with a lot of calories, things with a lot of fat and sugar and carbs. On the other hand, we do empathize with other animals, and I mean, in the case of dogs, we have essentially created relationship with dogs where they help us, we help them, and it's really helpful. And you could get the same thing with pigs. If you raise a pig, take care of it on your farm, and then one day you eat it. So you give it a good life, and then it nourishes you. So these things aren't like necessarily contradictory, but in modern society, it can feel that way because we don't even have contact with the animals. You know, a farmer somewhere, I'll never meet the pig, I'll never meet the farmer, is raising my food for me. And that would be a particularly like sort of novel situation. We didn't have factory farming forever. And I think when we stumble upon these kinds of contradictions where we have competing values, on the one hand, I want good food. On the other hand, I do care about animals. I think people just mostly avoid thinking about it. You know, they just don't want to think about it. And we almost have an agreement with other humans. I mean, a lot of people really hate PETA, which is I think it's a People for Ethical Treatment of Animals, because they force people to confront what's happening, and people don't want to confront it. And humans actually sort of cooperate with one another in not forcing each other to think about it. We don't bring up factory farming at the dinner table, because that will make me feel really icky while I'm trying to enjoy my, pepperoni pizza or whatever.
And yet they do go. They go to the farm. Okay, it's not depicted as a factory farm, but they go to the farm in the storybook. So they kind of go there, which intrigues me. They kind of go there,
They
but
never go
still
to a
keep that
factory
distance.
farm.
But they never go to a factory farm. No, no. I've
I think
noticed
the
actually, even
farming in England's a little better than in the US, but it's pretty bad here.
yeah, to be actually that is true. I think on the average it is better, but still, I'm not going to kid myself that it's wonderful. But I suppose there are levels of that. Okay. I wanted to come back actually, though we've already done this to some degree, but I wanted to come back to these darn scientists who we might imagine, because they're scientists, right? They are trained supposedly, and they're buying into the scientific method. So one would hope that, okay, at the barbecue or around the dinner table or in the pub or whatever it is, two people might discover that they have clashing views on religion or morality or who they're voting for, in the next election, whatever it is, fine. And okay, so scientists don't want to be ostracized, so they might keep their mouth shut or even tell a porky a lie, to maintain their credibility within their department, which functionally is understandable. And they may select what work they do, which maybe we can touch on in a moment as well. But nonetheless, when it comes to the study that they're doing and how they interpret that study, compared to previous work and that, I think it ebbs and flows actually, but I think the public like to think, and scientists themselves like to think, that at that moment, professionally, they're rational thinkers. Now, I found this statement from, I think I found it on Twitter, from Darwin, who led by example. And he was one of the good guys. Surely he was one of the good guys, and obviously one of the great scientists ever. And he wrote, I've got this written here. This is Darwin on what we now call confirmation bias. I very much doubt the phrase was available in the 19th century. He says, I had also during many years followed a golden rule, namely that whenever a published fact, a new observation or thought came across me, which was opposed to my general results, to make a memorandum of it without fail and at once, okay? For I had found by experience that such facts and thoughts were far more apt to escape from the memory than favourable ones. Last sentence. Owing to this habit, very few objections were raised against my views, which I had not at least noticed and attempted to answer. So he said, by doing this, by working really hard, he actually cut off at the pass or dealt with prior, a lot of issues that would otherwise criticisms made of his work. Now, is it the case that all scientists subsequent to Darwin, many of whom revere Darwin, is it the case that we all maintain those high standards that he set himself?
No.
I mean, apart from you and me, obviously.
Right. Yeah. No, but I would say there's a, okay, are scientists better than other people at this kind of thing? I don't know. I suspect they actually might be better when you look outside of their particular research area, the thing that is their baby. They might be better at sort of following the evidence and updating their beliefs as they go. I'm not 100% sure that's true. And scientists are merely human. Darwin is a particularly standout human, and I'm sure there are plenty of other scientists who are better than others at this, but on average, scientists are pretty human-y. And even if they're trained, um, the training, we're sort of trained to collect data, analyze data and support a particular hypothesis, where I don't even think we really get trained to falsify our beliefs or just search for potential evidence that could falsify our beliefs. Scientists are incentivized to publish papers, a lot of them, and in good journals. And the way you do that is by finding evidence for something interesting. And so I think you really have to think about so you can think about what is science saying it's doing versus what is science actually doing and how do scientists actually gain status. And the way scientists gain status is by discovering something interesting and publishing papers on it. And so that's what scholars should be motivated to do. Being right can be helpful, but discovering something brand new that's true is really, really hard. A lot of people have been doing science for a really long time. A lot of the interesting things have been discovered already. And so in order for scholars to find something really new and surprising that's going to get them in a top journal, there are like all kinds of little sneaky manipulative things they do to try to make their findings look that way. People will make excessively broad claims. They act as though they're saying something completely novel, where really they're just repackaging something other people have said before. Sometimes they're committing outright fraud, faking data. Other times they're doing like more minor things. We call this p hacking, which is just little deceptive statistical techniques scientists can use to make the results look better than they really are. Those are now considered more of a no-no, but 10, 15 years ago, pretty much everyone was doing them. So I don't know that scientists are better, and I don't know that anyone has ever shown that scientists are better or more rational. We have a toolkit that can help us with that, but we also have a toolkit that can help us create fake information or deceptive information. And scientists, their reputations are tied up in their ability to do that. It's not like they have a whole other career that gives them meaning, like they're a nurse or something. And so they don't really care about whatever their area of expertise is. That is their thing. Like that's what they care about. So I would expect that scientists are probably more defensive than an average person, especially when it comes to their area of expertise.
That's a big issue, right?
It's a big issue. It is and it isn't, because sometimes I'm like, does it really matter who's right in some of these scientific debates? Like, so many of them are sort of like theoretical and have no practical significance to the real world, but some of
that
them
is
do.
true. Some of them do. It seems to me there's little jeopardy for most scientists. Like they can write something, make a claim, and nothing happens to them if they're wrong. If someone's producing a policy piece for politicians or for some company or industry that's going to act on it,
Yeah.
right? So, can I pump this into the water and it won't have any effect on the fish?
Right.
I mean, you need to get that right. Otherwise, I guess the industry will sue the scientists that they employ to do the work. I'm not sure, but anyway, it seems that there's more jeopardy there. Whereas for many scientists, and perhaps university-based scientists in particular, who are doing quite theoretical stuff, or even if it's applied, there's kind of this gap between them and the outcome. It doesn't generally affect. It can affect reputation, but most of the time, and some scientists have quipped to me, some researchers have said, well, we publish this piece of work, and if we find something in the future that shows something opposite to that, well, we'll publish that then,
Mm-hmm.
which is good.
Yeah.
but to them has had no effect. It means they've got an extra publication, and actually that may reflect perfectly reasonable development of the field. But still, there's no jeopardy for them at any point. So if they get
Yeah,
the work published,
the feedback it can take such a long period of time, and it can be so indirect. So I publish something that's false, but I'm just, I work at a university. I don't work for companies, whatever. I'm just doing my research. Someone else comes along and is like, I wonder if we can apply this to some organizational context. They work on that. Then they work with someone else, like a consultant, goes work for the company. 15 years later, we're like, why didn't this intervention work? Like, this is based on this paper that was published in Nature 15 years ago. It should have worked. It didn't. The scientist doesn't get sued. The scientist may have retired by then. So the consequences for scientists are often really low. Now, except in the context you're talking about, if I'm directly hired by someone and I make a promise and then I fail to deliver on that promise, then, I might get fired or I might get sued, depending on how big the consequences were. But I think in those kinds of situations, the scientists are probably better because they know they're going to pay this immediate price, or they're going to get found out immediately that their science is no good. In academia, that's almost never the case. It's almost never the case that we pay a price for being wrong. And so a lot of the research we do, on the one hand, it seems like it matters a lot because it kind of becomes like public knowledge. But often it doesn't. Like my first research projects were motivated free will beliefs. So like, do people believe more in free will when they want to punish people? Does that matter at all for anything? Some people have tried to make arguments that it applies to like criminal justice system, but if it's ever affected anybody, I don't know that it has. And if it affected anyone in a negative way, I don't think I would be held culpable. So the actual stakes for me to be right are pretty low. They're essentially just like, can I get away with this? Can I push this narrative and get status for it and not get called out in the near future? And people do get called out. There's actually just a case that's happening. It's unfolding right now with a professor at Harvard who it seems as though might have committed quite a bit of fraud. But she was like very successful for a pretty long time. She's at Harvard. She's got a great job. She's making a lot of money giving speeches for organizations and stuff. In her case, it didn't pan out. But for a lot of people, if you're not going to commit fraud, if you're just going to do other little sneakier things that aren't that big of a deal, you might get away with that your whole career and be very successful and have a great reputation, and never pay a price. So you have to think, like, if scientists are going to be pursuing truth, then there need to be incentives for them to do that and not just to support their own career. And there really aren't.
So you would advocate for that. You feel that perhaps there should be, that the system should somehow be changed to make these scientists a little bit more responsible for what they publish and the implications of what they publish.
Yeah, so this is what I'm trying to get scientists to participate in adversarial collaborations. It's not so much incentivizing the truth so much as making it impossible to not pursue the truth. So in an adversarial collaboration, you put together two people who have competing hypotheses. I want X to be true, you want X to be false. If we have to work together, then I'm not going to be able to design rigged methods that support my hypothesis. You're not going to be able to either. I'm not going to be able to design a test that's only going to confirm my hypothesis. And if it doesn't, I file draw it, because you're not going to let me do that. And so by getting these people together, you would sort of get rid of all of the sneaky things scholars do to support. You're not going to let me make broader claims than are warranted by the data. You're like, no, let's be real. This was a small effect. We only found it in this one condition. You can't be like making this like, extravagant claim that you've solved the problems of the world. So by getting people to work with adversaries, I think you can change things and make it so, look, we're trying to solve a problem, X or not X, and we're going to publish the results no matter what. We're going to get a paper for it no matter what. It supports my theory. It doesn't matter. That's not what this is about. This isn't about me versus you. It's about what's true. And again, it's not really incentivizing science. I'm hoping that this becomes a norm, and scholars, because it becomes a norm, scholars feel compelled to participate. So even if I don't want to, even if I don't want to put my theory at risk of disconfirmation, if I know no one's going to take me seriously unless I agree to participate in adversarial collaboration, because if I don't, then I look shady. Like, what do I have to hide? I think that's the way that these could become a normal part of science. And I think that would actually help a lot. But right now, nobody wants to do them. So
Well, very, very few,
that's
very
the
few.
tricky
Yeah,
part.
yeah,
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 very
very
few.
few. But hopefully, maybe it'll become, yeah, as you say, the norm slowly but surely over time. People
Yeah,
almost feel that if they're going to find the answer, they've got to involve themselves in an adversarial collaboration. So you get two sides of it. You agree beforehand um, where the line is for deciding true or false to this belief, this hypothesis, which is not easy to do, but it can be done prior to the experiments and with support perhaps from other scientists, so everyone knows where they stand, and then you run the experiment that's been pre-agreed, and the answer is the answer, and there's no wriggle room. There's
exactly.
no wriggle room. So coming back, Cory, so you're in as good a position as anybody to know how people find wriggle room, how
Mm.
people can bend and flex, scientists can bend and flex their results. You referred to p hacking, where scientists often end up with a p value at the end of their statistical analysis. And if it's a nice low p value, they can say they've got an exciting, significant result. And if the p value's a high number, then they don't. And scientists often like to get exciting results rather than say that they haven't got an exciting finding. So there are various ways, quantitatively and qualitatively, to move things, tweak things, move the dial slowly but surely through their studies to make it more likely that their p-value will be low and they can announce to the world that they've got an exciting finding. So you know all about that. You know about cognitive bias and irrational thinking, and you're in the university system. So how much do you employ these tactics?
Oh, that's a good question. Um,
I mean, you
yeah,
may employ them
I
more than other people because you know all the
because I
tricks.
know I know what I can do. But I've also called people out, and so by doing that, I put myself at risk of being called out if I participate.
Yes.
I do. So I wrote one of the first, maybe the first paper I ever published, again on the motivated free will beliefs. I said something really insane, like, this suggests, oh gosh, I wish I remembered it. Someone called me out later on it. But I made this really absurdly broad claim about how, like, this suggests that all free will beliefs throughout human history are about this and not that. You know, I said something that's totally unwarranted by my data, which was like, people believe a little bit more in free will when they're wanting to punish someone. Um, and somebody later who was challenging my findings pointed out that claim. And I did acknowledge that it was a ridiculously broad claim that was not warranted by my data. So I know for sure that I do this. And you can see, like, one thing that scholars, so a few things. One thing they do is they use this sort of like wishy-washy language that doesn't really mean anything, that isn't quantified. Um, I just wrote a piece on adversarial collaboration for the Institute for Art and Ideas, which is in London, actually. Um, and I gave an example from one of my own papers where you can make the claim, political liberals have a pro-woman bias. Well, that sounds pretty interesting. Like, wow, liberals have a pro-woman bias, across context, and they always have, and they always will, and this is true in every country. But what the finding is that the finding in this paper was political liberals in these like three samples tended to find it more plausible that women evolved to be better leaders than that men evolved to be better leaders than women. So it's this one context, it's these three samples, but that's not that's not the headline you put on the paper, right? You put the really broad, exciting claim as the headline, and then the details are buried somewhere in the results section. Um, so that's an example of excessively broad claims. Then the wishy-washy thing is you say something like, scholars before me have really emphasized how biased people are, but I say they're more rational than people think. Okay, more rational than people think. Well, what do people think? How rational are they? And how much more rational are you saying they are than what people think? You're like making a claim, but you're not actually saying anything meaningful that could be falsified, because you're not saying how rational, what did the people before you even say regarding this? And is what you're saying any different? So there are a lot of things people do. I'm sure that I've done all of the things I criticize in papers before. Um, I do try to be better about these things now, I think, when I think about them. And I am participating in a lot of adversarial collaborations. Some of them are things I care about. Some of them are things I don't care that much about. So maybe that doesn't really count. Um, but I think now that I've sort of called attention to these things that scientists do, and that I'm now advocating for adversarial collaborations. If anyone ever challenged me to one, I would have to say yes, even if I wanted to say no, which is better than the current norm where people, I think the default is probably to say no. Although we'll see, maybe that will change. But yeah, scholars are reluctant to relinquish these things, but they will when they have to. So with the p hacking stuff, in like 2012, people really started around 2012, people started calling attention to these things, and then they started calling for new norms, such as, you have to put on a time-stamped document what analyses you're going to run, and then you can only run those analyses. And if you don't, then you have to say, oh, we deviated from our pre-registered plans. You have to say, this is my hypothesis, time-stamped before you collect the data. And if you don't find support for that, you can't say, oh, I predicted this other thing all along. No, you didn't. We know you didn't because you said you didn't. A lot of people were, and some people still are very reluctant to adopt those new higher standards, but people are adopting them. And now it's getting to the point where it's no longer defensible not to. Like, scholars who don't make their data publicly available, scholars who never pre-register their studies, I suspect these people are now starting to be viewed with some suspicion. And in order to preserve their reputations as good scientists, they will have to do it even if they don't want to. Nobody wants to. It makes it harder for all of us, but it's better for science, the institution, if we agree to do it.
Oh, no doubt. A couple of points. I mean, one is I could imagine maybe in 50 years' time or 10 years' time, maybe, no, a bit longer than 10 years, that it will, what we've been doing up until about now will seem really antiquated and rubbish. That scientists just went off and collected some data and then kind of back calculated their hypotheses half the time and kind of made a nice story. Well, clearly, how could people get away with that? This was awful. I could see that. Yes. On the other hand, so this is the second point, I'm not sure whether it's always the right setup. So you're a psychologist. These experiments you run, so forth, are very difficult. However, they're kind of, if I may say so, well, in general, so I'm not talking about psychologists in general, they're kind of clean cut in that they're often in the lab or through questionnaires. And compare that to an ecologist who may go out into the field and finds 7 albatross. Right, and then puts a logger on 4 of them because the other 3 she could never catch, and so gets data for 4 albatross and is trying to understand where on earth they go and whether the wind patterns affect where they travel to. That sort of research, which I guess one would say is more exploratory, it may not be viable to put in pre-application stating hypotheses and things. Do you see what I mean? So it may be most suitable, what you're suggesting may be most suitable in areas where the knowledge base is bigger, and maybe also where the context for the science is more controllable.
Yeah, so I think the big thing is really just the transparency. So it's just being honest. If it's exploratory, then you say it's exploratory. If you had no hypothesis, then you say you had no hypothesis. And in general, so long as it's ethical to do so, you share your data publicly so people can see what you do. If you analyze the data 10 ways, well, you got to report all 10. You can't just report the one way that worked for you. So I agree that different fields of science and even just different like particular studies within a discipline are going to be more or less appropriate for like a full-on pre-registration where you say everything you're going to do. But I think the norms of transparency probably apply for all scientific disciplines. Off the top of my head, I can't think of any that wouldn't.
No, I agree. Transparency is difficult to argue against.
Yes.
Difficult to
Yeah.
argue against.
Yeah. I'm
Um,
trying to get journals to increase their transparency now too, because that is one area of scientific decision making. You know, what are the reviewers saying? What are they critiquing? And what are the editors saying? And what are they critiquing? That mostly all happens in secret. So there's just no accountability for reviewers and editors to be fair or consistent or not hold double standards for papers they like and dislike or authors they like and dislike for whatever reason. Um, and so I'm wondering if now might be the time, now that scientists are finally agreeing to be more transparent in their science, well, maybe other scientific decision making should be happening out in the open too. Um, but we'll see if I can get anyone to accept that that argument.
oh well, I wish you best of luck with that. That's very,
Thank
very
you.
important. I think some journals are receptive, but it partly depends on how onerous it is for them, right? And how expensive it's going to be, time costly, bringing in new software to make everything available that wasn't before. But yes,
There are some now
there are
that
some.
share all their peer reviews openly.
Yes.
I think mostly for acceptance, though, not for rejection. And I feel like rejections would be really useful too, because that's the stuff that scientists are like, no, we don't want that.
Yeah, yeah, no, I
Sometimes for
totally
really
agree.
good reasons, but sometimes maybe not for good reasons. So,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, it has to be both sides of the ledger. Cory, you mentioned a couple of times in passing free will. Could we briefly, is it ever possible to briefly discuss free will relatively briefly?
no.
Finish on a, yes, tricky. So for free will, not an easy one, but something you're also expert in and have thought about a lot. Whether it's your choice or not is debatable. Um, I think again, I'm going to suggest that arrogantly that most people think that they, and therefore other people, have free will, in that that is what we feel we experience. Whether we do experience another matter, but we get the sense that we experience that we make the choices. We make choices. So just to be clear to people, so I think let's just be clear on what we mean by free will. And I say we be clear, you be clear, because you're better at this than me. So can you just explain briefly what free will means?
I mean, even that could take hours because there are a lot of debates. Um, so philosophers now have these different definitions of free will. The one that I think would maybe be the traditional one that philosophers now call libertarian free will is essentially the ability to do otherwise, holding everything else constant. So in a given moment of time, I'm the same person, the social setting is exactly the same, but I could do A or I could do B. Um, but philosophers are now, for example, there's like a lot of philosophers are compatibilists, and these are people who think that you don't need that level of free will to be morally responsible.
Oh,
Uh,
stop. No, yes, sorry. I'm going to be really,
okay,
yes. But I think for here, I think that first explanation is
libertarian.
in, I think that's great. So you're
Okay.
sitting there, you could choose to, take a drink of water if you had a glass with you or not. You're able to make that choice. Now, I think, oh, there we are, or a can of something. Fizzy pop.
Sparkling water. Yeah.
Sparkling water. I was really right. Okay, and I just chosen to do the same with my still water. Mm. So that the idea that we get to choose to do it, and I think most people, understandably, would see that as a no-brainer. That of course they've chosen to take that drink or not chosen to take that drink, right? But in reality, the bombshell realization is that that's actually not true. Is that fair?
um,
Or that
so
they're not
depends.
consciously making the choice. Sorry, carry on.
It depends how we describe choice. So it's like on the one hand, yes, I could choose to sip my sparkling water or not. But what is causing me to do that? Am I just this like free floating agent that's completely unaffected by my environment or whatever? Because if I'm exactly the same up until the moment, there's no reason that should compel me to sip or not sip. Um, I think one thing is people sort of get hung up on the feeling of choosing and what that means in terms of the causal history and how your own free-floating consciousness could potentially like interfere with the decision making. Like I'm going to sip my drink if I'm thirsty. What caused me to be thirsty? Well, maybe the last time I had a sip, maybe because my room's a little warm. There are going to be all these causal factors that contribute to whether I make this decision or not. And the confusing thing to me is that it seems people think that it would be better if nothing compelled you to act or not act. It was just you chose to do it. But to me, that would almost be worse because that would mean that there was no reason you acted or didn't act, right? So it seems to me that this idea that there's this free floating self that can somehow override the environment and your genes and just make decisions regardless of those things, that to me doesn't make a human really any more impressive than that I'm this information processing machine that makes decisions based on my current, state and who I am as a person because of my genes and my environment. So I would say I have been persuaded over time that it is a mistake to say that we have that kind of free will. At the same time, I think it's impossible, probably, to get people to not feel that. Like the self feels like this thing that's not, it's sort of separate from my physical existence and my genes. Like people don't even know what their genes are. We don't know how these affect our behavior. Um, uh, I think it's probably impossible to get rid of that illusion. So we'll never persuade people that they don't have free will. And I'm not sure it's even a noble goal to try to persuade people of that because I think probably the concept of responsibility itself serves an important function in us regulating our own behavior and also how we think about other people's behavior and hold them responsible. So
Yes, hang on. Yes, very much so. So hang on,
okay.
because there's a lot on the table there which you explained beautifully, and I already realised that my understanding, which I knew was pretty poor, is even poorer than I thought it was, and it made
I
my heart
confuse
rate go
myself
up,
every
and
time I talk about it.
I feel a bit put out actually, and
Yeah.
almost a bit ostracized. One way I've tried to think about this, which again is quite limited. So again, you pull me up on this. I'm actively looking for you to do that. So I guess Americans might, well, no, it doesn't work. Pool table or maybe a snooker table. Pool table. So somebody strikes the white ball, goes down the table. If they're any good, they're going to hit the pack of balls and they start spread. And maybe that white ball could be likened to, let's say there is a beginning. So we'll say the Big Bang, right? And so at the moment they struck the white ball, there's no further input to the table, and the balls bounce around for a while and they hit each other. And it's, anyway, they're always going to do, they always do what they were going to do at the moment that the white ball had been struck and was going down the table. And likewise, on a far, far grander scale, um, that's happening, that's playing out in our universe. If there's only one universe, let's imagine there's one universe, that's playing out in our universe right now and has been doing so for many billions of years, etc. So we'll start from the Big Bang, won't go beyond before that because who knows, but at the point of the Big Bang, the equivalent of the white ball being struck, atoms, etc., are interacting with each other. A small number of those atoms become you and I and other people, and we're always going to do, like, the Earth is going to move where it does in space. Okay, orbits the sun, but it's always going to do it. We
I
are always going to do what we're going to do, despite, okay, we're a complex set of atoms that come together and have got a consciousness, but that's kind of separate to the fact that things are playing out as they're playing out, and they're like the balls on the table. There's no way to affect them.
So you're asserting determinism, which I don't think anyone knows whether that's true or not. And I don't even know if we'll ever know if that's true or not, because of like potential randomness in the universe. But I actually, and people want to say like that is the alternative. Either determinism is true and we don't have free will, or it's false and we do. But I actually think determinism is completely irrelevant to whether we have free will. because you have to think of what is the additional force. So I think the pool example is really good. I hit the pool ball. Let's say I'm the pool ball, okay? I'm the cue ball, right? That's what it's called, the white ball. So I get hit by a stick. Now, because of my shape and size and the friction on the pool table, however, whatever direction I got hit, I'm going to go a particular way and I'm going to hit a particular thing. Well, what if I instead veered right? Well, what caused me to veer right? If it's nothing, um, is that free will? Nothing impelled me to do it? Or is it something? There was a pebble on the table and I went right. If it's something, then I went right for a reason. And if it's nothing, then I went right for no reason. And is either of those free will?
Okay, but yes, excellent point, right? And again, you're way ahead of me on this, so I'm just probing for the sake of interest. The regardless of the presence of the pebble or not, does this not become an issue for the human being because we are consciously aware of what we're doing? And so the question becomes, does our consciousness drive the choice that we make?
Mm-hmm. But where
Yeah.
does our consciousness come from, right? So like I think consciousness is another problem that we haven't figured out and we maybe never will. Uh, but it would be a mistake to say that our consciousness comes from, it either comes from something,
Yes.
then it's random, and that's not that cool. Oh, my free will is just random decisions. And if it's something, then I can trace the causal history back throughout my life. I made this decision for a reason, it's these reasons. And that's also not free will. So I feel like you're kind of stuck either with external causes or causes that eventually can be traced to the external, or you're stuck with random nothingness. And that's not what people want free will to be either. They want free will to be this somehow autonomous thing that is reason driven, but not reasons determined.
I'm not sure the randomness, I'm not sure whether there's a principle of randomness or not matters. Because the way I'm thinking about it, which again is limited, is kind of that it's likely to be a bottom up rather than a top down process for making decisions. So, for example, we've all experienced being in the shower or in the
Mhm,
bath if you're lucky enough to, and something pops into your head, such as, oh,
mhm,
I must take the chicken out of the freezer to defrost for this evening. Or I hope I remember, when I
mhm,
get downstairs or whatever it's get to the kitchen or whatever it is to defrost the chicken. Now, when people have that moment in the shower, and maybe it's a more inspirational thought than get the chicken out. That's all that comes to me is the chicken come out of the freezer. But I think what people, and again, I'm imagining that I know what other people think. So, I'm pushing my luck a bit here. But I think people think normally they choose what they think. And on this one occasion, they didn't. It sprung into their head, and that occasionally things spring into their mind. And it can be just when they've woken up in the morning or when they're in the shower or whatever it is, and it springs into their mind. But isn't it a leading question for you? Isn't it the case that everything just springs into our mind? Everything does. So I must get the chicken out of the fridge. I'm now going to step out of the shower. I'm now going to take the towel. I'm going to angle the towel this way. I'm going to rub my body this hard. I'm going to stop doing. Right. Everything is bubbling up into our
mhm,
consciousness so that we become aware of it rather than our consciousness looking at the options that are available to us at any given moment, whatever options is a bit tricky, and choosing one. I suppose that now, sorry, that may be orthogonal to the points that you're making, but I guess that's the way I'm thinking about things.
that's that's related to the point I'm making because I'm saying like determinism can be true or not true, but things are going to occur to you, and that doesn't mean you can't direct your attention or uh, the thing is the thing that's directing your attention is also coming from somewhere else. So you can say, well, what's the point if I don't have free will? Like, what's the point of getting out of bed in the morning? It's like, well, that thought that you're having right now will determine, or not determine, but it will influence whether you get out of bed in the morning. And you'll also think about, well, I might lose my job if I do get out of bed. I'm going to lose my job, so I'm going to get out of bed. Um, and it, to me, I think it's just a sort of feature of human psychology that we can't escape that feeling that there's this completely autonomous, free-floating agent making decisions when everything we do is caused by something or it's caused by nothing, right? And none of that points to some free-floating agent that has power over who we are or what we do. So, people are like, well, you could work harder. Like, you could, like, why don't I start exercising? Well, some people are more likely to be the kind of people who are going to exercise, and some people are less likely to be those people. And maybe you watch a really inspirational movie and that gives you the motivation to do it, but it's caused by something, right? It's always caused by something. So to me, the concept of free will doesn't even really make sense, and I'm not sure what people are saying that it is. And I have never heard anyone really make a good argument for what it is that would make it something impressive, I guess. Um,
Well,
but
here's one more try at it, and I don't have the answer, but here's one more sort of analogy that what we're doing, in a sense, as human beings, is watching a video play out, watching a movie play out, if you like. That we experience these things, that these things, gosh, this is terrible, these things happen to us, that we have a sense that we're making the choices, but we're not. Now that sounds like we're robots or something, and we're not. I'm not saying it's a good or a bad thing. I'm just interested in the truth because I'm a pure
yeah.
scientist. But is there some value to that analogy, or do you feel that doesn't mean anything? Is that adds no value?
What, like being a robot?
Being, beg your pardon, being
A
that we're
very
effectively watching, it's like we're watching a movie play out our lives.
um
In that we don't choose when we watch a movie, we don't choose what happens in the movie, and we're not
well,
really choosing what's happening. We're experiencing what happens.
that is true, but the difference is that humans are responsive to incentive, so our behavior can be changed by external features of the environment, whereas the movie, it doesn't matter what you do to the movie. You could yell at the movie and it's going to keep doing its thing. If you yell at a human, they're going to change what they do, which is one thing that I find quite interesting. I think actually what we think of free will when we think of other people, it's not so much how much control people have over their lives, but how much we can control them with our behavior that we impose on them. So like I can, you know, this kind of comes back to the ostracism thing. Like if I threaten to ostracize someone for saying something or doing something, they're not going to say it or do it. And so they'll change their behavior in response to their environment. And we can say that that's them having free will, or we can say they are a creature that is responsive to incentives and that can be manipulated by their environments. Um, and I think that's I'm kind of working on a paper about this idea now, which is essentially like free will isn't something we attribute to people who have control over their own behavior. It's something we attribute to people who we can control with our behavior. Um, and that's what makes a human, I think, different from a movie, is that it's all humans are interacting with other humans and they're affecting each other, and changing how they behave, as well as the environment. The environment changes and that causes humans to change too, but not because of their free will, just because humans are responsive to their environments and they're responsive to social pressures, and to avoid getting ostracized or killed or to attract a mate, they'll do all kinds of behaviors to accomplish their goals. But again, those desires are, some of them are wired into the person, some of them are learned over time. And I don't think any of them would constitute like libertarian free will. To use the
Okay.
scare quotes. Maybe I've just created more confusion.
No, look, it's a brilliant topic, and yes, I mean it's almost impossible to talk about it enough, I think, to nail it because it may be unnailable. But
Right.
as you've alluded to very well, so I think that's very helpful for people. It shouldn't put people off trying to think about these things more. I I want to be cheeky and ask you one more question, and it is this is not quite a tough question actually, on free will. Not tough as in just difficult one to think about. I'm sure it's something that you have thought about, and I think it's a fun one for people to envisage. So you'll understand the scenario, you'll know the scenario, you'll be familiar with it. You, Cory, are a judge in a courtroom, all right? And you've got one case in the morning and one in the afternoon. It's kind of Judge Dredd style. You get through these cases pretty quickly. I'm thinking this up as I go along. But they're both murder cases, so they're a big deal, very big deal. And the person in the morning, guilty as charged, killed someone, and a scan has shown that they've got, I don't know, a frontal lobe missing, or gosh, I don't know too much about neurobiology, the bit of the brain that might have stopped them murdering, or would have helped to make it less likely that they would have murdered someone, right? So you've got that person. And then in the afternoon, there's another murder. You get through these cases, say, Judge Dredd style, very quickly. And they've had a brain scan and there's nothing seemed to be wrong with their brain. Right. And it's a similar sort of context and case. So relatively, how long do you send each of these people down for? So the morning person, the MRI scan, brain limitations in some respect. The person in the afternoon, brain scan, no evidence of that. What's your decision?
I would probably want to know what the laws are in my state.
So I say
regarding those
relatively, right?
cases.
The relative degree of punishment, whatever that is, or no punishment, but you could also have zero punishment.
Yeah. Can I answer that hypothetically as myself as a judge? I don't know. Most people would treat the first case more leniently. A relevant consideration to me would be like, is this person capable of learning? Some people would say, just desserts, whatever. Like if you murder someone, then you need to be punished, regardless of what caused you to do it. Because you can make the case for anyone. Well, you had a brain injury and that caused you to murder someone. Well, what if you were born a psychopath? You didn't choose to be born a psychopath. So let's let all the psychopaths off. Well, what if you were born just like on the very bottom, 0.01 percentile and whatever it is? Well, let's let all those people off. No one is really choosing their character, but some people are more responsive to incentives and learning and social sanctions and judgments. And so some people, the threat of being sent to jail for 5 years would stop them from doing something. For some people, do nothing. For some people, the threat of ostracism will do something. For some people, do nothing. And I think we really do judge the people who are responsive to those kinds of things as more responsible, which is kind of interesting because we're actually holding people to a higher standard if they kind of care more. But yeah, I didn't answer your question. I think it's complicated, and I'm also like I'm very like low in punitiveness, so I have I'm not good at thinking about these things anyway. So it's like I have to extract myself and my own feelings from like what is best for society. And I think probably it is best for society that we punish people. Do they ultimately deserve it? No, probably not. But can we behave as though if we just like let everyone off the hook for everything because we're like, it's your genes and your environment, you didn't choose it, it's not your fault. Then there'll probably be a lot more raping and murdering happening, and we don't want that either. So, yeah, I don't think I have the moral compass perfectly calibrated there, but I think they're both worth considering, probably.
I think it's an impossible question in a sense, which
Yeah.
is why I called it cheeky.
What about you? What sentences do you give them? Let's hear your perfect answer.
I wasn't expecting that. My goodness, I don't know the answer. And as you point out, it depends partly, I guess, if one is punishing or trying to help, or one would make an example of, which isn't the phrase you use, but there's an element that if one considers it important to make an example of people who have done wrong, then the choice might be to give them equal sentences.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever those sentences are, which is another issue, but just the comparison might be equal sentences. If it's about punishing them, well, this is the clear link, in my view, my limited view, back to free will, because there's one argument to say, and again, you alluded to this, if someone's born a psychopath, it's not their fault, weirdly. And so would you therefore have to say, well, just bad luck, how awful for you to have experienced murdering someone and having to live with the fact that you've murdered someone and perhaps have
Or how
flashbacks
awful
to it.
that you were born a person who wants to murder people and enjoys
Right.
it. Because I wouldn't want to be born a person who likes to murder people.
Right, there we are. So
Yeah.
they're actually very unlucky.
Yeah.
And even more unlucky was the person who's dead, but they're dead.
Mm-hmm.
You're not dead, so we're going to give all our sympathy to you and maybe a crowdfunding and no. So, but then maybe it evokes this issue of disgust, I think, because
Yeah.
it sounds
Well, and the
disgusting to
family of
treat.
the victim would not
Oof.
be happy. They're like, it's not their fault. Sorry.
Yes.
It's a bummer that your daughter got killed, but it's a bummer this guy killed her, you know?
Yeah. So it's
Yeah.
a super tricky one. It's a super tricky one.
But I
But
think the
we,
thing with these questions is like, we can debate them all day. You're not going to change human intuitions about this kind of thing. I don't think.
well,
Maybe
hang
I'm
on,
wrong
hang on.
about that.
In the US, again, you alluded to this, I think in the US, in a few states, on occasions, people are put to death by the state if
Mm-hmm.
they commit extreme crimes.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas I think it would be the case, for example, in the Netherlands.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I don't know about mass murderers in the Netherlands, of which presumably there aren't many, partly because of the low population, etc., etc. But I'm sure, fairly confident that the punishments they give are way lower
Mm-hmm.
relatively to, for example, the US, despite the fact they're two comparative countries in terms of westernization and so forth. So actually, there can be, I think, relatively different views.
Well, yeah, I mean, the question of should we kill the person versus like what punishment is appropriate. I think it would be hard to persuade people that we shouldn't be punishing people at all when they do something horrible because they didn't choose it. I think that's the intuition. Now, how
Yes.
severely should they be punished? I think that is very, if you like read about medieval torture or medieval punishments, they're like doing some pretty horrific things that not even the US would do today. Yeah, so I think that's really that can be really culturally influenced, but I don't think there's any getting rid of the desire to punish people who do really horrific things, even if we were to gain a better understanding of why they did it and eventually come to accept you were born with this genetic profile. There was a 90% chance you're going to turn out this way anyway. And then once we put you in that foster home, it was over. You know, um, I think it would be really hard to get rid of
And I think there
the
are two reasons for that. I think there are two reasons. One, because you want to encourage people not to do these things, so they're made an example of. So they
yeah
may be sacrificed on the altar of a reduction in future murders because it's seen that you go to prison.
right.
But also, which again is terribly bad luck for this person if one adheres to this idea that they were born unlucky to be a psychopath, etc., etc., and now they're going to be put in prison as well. How awful! But secondly, also because there's a deep, which may be difficult to nail, but there's a deep intrinsic need, desire for the people that have been wronged. So this would be
Mm-hmm.
probably the family, maybe friends of the person who's murdered. You can't do anything about, to get justice. And that seems a deeply intrinsically human expression and requirement.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. And yes, I think it would always be difficult to argue, and I'm not saying that we should, against that desire, that that's something that is an artifact, an unnecessary artifact, a bug in the system. I think people would struggle to agree with that.
Yeah, I think both of them are sort of part of the same process. You want to signal to people that you're not to be messed with, because whenever people mess with me and my family and my group, I get revenge. But then there's also, we can't have these people running around in our social group causing chaos. And so we need to control that and then show other people, if someone else in the group was thinking of going on a killing spree, now they know they're not going to get away with it because we take that very seriously. And that's why I think, like, we can debate free will, but it's also worth reflecting on, well, why do we have these beliefs and responsibility, and what are they doing? How are they functioning in society? And is it possible that even if they're somewhat misguided, they actually are functional? And I think that's very possible. Although people have proposed other ways of dealing with things, like instead of sending people to prison, you send them somewhere where they're pulled away from society, but they're slightly more pleasant. But I don't know. They're tough to sell that idea that we should be treating murderers and rapists well, even if they're not in the public.
Yes, I agree. I agree with you entirely. Well, finishing on full agreement is absolutely key to keeping my heart rate down. And
finishing on murderers and rapists.
Yes, we agree on those. Cory, thank you so much. You've been very generous with your time. This has been genuinely extremely interesting. I could pick your brains all day, but I will do so no more. As always, it would be useful for people who've listened to this and who would like to know more about what you do and find more from you, which I'm sure they will. Where's the best places to discover you?
I have a website, which I think is coryjclark.com, Cory, no E. And I think I have all my other things on there. So like Twitter and my adversarial collaboration project and my email, and a lot of my papers are up there too. So that would probably be the best place.
That's brilliant. Cory, thank you very much.
And you can read about my goat farm a little bit.
Oh, and the goat farm there as well. Yeah, okay, the most important part. We agree on that as well.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.